The Clemson Class was built just after the First World War and reflected most of the lessons that had been learned during that conflict. Until the arrival of the Fletcher class, the Clemsons were the most numerous class of destroyer produced for the United States Navy. They were really an outgrowth of the Wicks class of mid-war destroyers, with the last lesson of the war being the need for a destroyer to be capable of significant anti-submarine work. As such, the Clemson was about 75 tons heavier, with most of this going into additional fuel storage for longer-range operations, as well as a larger rudder, a single 3-inch anti-aircraft gun, and provisions to swap the main armament for 5-inch guns at a later date. Weighing in at just over 1,200 tons at normal load, the ships were quite fast, being capable of 35 knots, which allowed them to be used as fleet escorts. The distinctive profile, with no forecastle step-down and 4 funnels in close arrangement, led to the class being termed four-stackers, or alternatively, flush-deckers. After over a decade of tight budgets and virtually no destroyers being built, Congress had finally opened the floodgates to a program that also saw the Colorado and Omaha classes built, and the South Dakota and Lexington classes started. Between the Wicks and Clemson classes, a total of 267 destroyers would be completed in less than a decade, of which 156 would be Clemson-class ships completed between 1918 and 1922. The primary armament consisted of 4 guns of 4-inch caliber, 1 at the front, 1 at the rear, and 1 on each side, for a broadside of 3 guns, along with 12 torpedo tubes in 4 triple launchers, a pair on each side. The lone 3-inch anti-aircraft gun already mentioned completed the ballistic and self-propelled weaponry. A number of ships were modified to replace the rearmost 4-inch gun with a 3-inch weapon that would give more room for depth charge racks. Additionally, a small number of ships had alternate main gun loadouts. The USS Hovey and its sister ship, the Long, were given 4 twin 4-inch turrets instead of single mounts for a total of 8 guns, whilst the Hatfield, Brooks, Gilmer, Fox, and Kane were given single 5-inch guns in place of the standard 4-inch weapons. Between the wars, the ships of Destroyer Squadron 11, all Clemsons, became involved in the Honda Point disaster, where a squadron sailed at full speed through heavy fog, simulating wartime conditions for an exercise. However, due to the Great Tokyo earthquake some days before, additional heavy currents and waves were present on the Californian coast that made their dead reckoning navigation method inaccurate. The lead ship had radio direction finding devices, but it was new, and so when it reported a position that was different from the dead reckoning, it was ignored. Therefore, the ships were ordered to turn south far too early, and 7 of them promptly ran aground and were lost. Another pair went aground but managed to get free, and the locals and the remaining destroyers of the squadron were left having to rescue the crews of their sister ships, a number of which had keeled over completely. 23 men were killed and many injured. Under the terms of the London Naval Treaty, a large number of the Clemson class were decommissioned, with some brought out of retirement as more active ships were worn out through use. As the 1930s progressed, some of the ships were then converted into mine layers, high-speed transports, minesweepers, and seaplane tenders. Another 19 would be transferred to the Royal Navy as part of the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, and confusingly became part of the Town class. Once America became involved in the Second World War, the ships were rearmed with dual-purpose 3-inch guns to give them some degree of anti-aircraft capacity. The converted ships would receive 2 or 3 guns, whilst those that were still operating as destroyers would receive 6. Due to their age and relatively weak armament, they were not involved in the heaviest fighting except where this was unavoidable. 6 of the transferred ships and 14 ships still in US Navy service would be lost in the Second World War to a variety of causes, but mainly enemy action. Of the ships that were sunk, 3 notable examples are the USS Reuben James, which became the first American warship to be sunk in the Second World War, despite America not yet having joined the war. As part of a neutrality patrol, she'd positioned herself between a convoy and a German wolf pack of submarines, and she was struck by a torpedo that was intended for a merchant ship. She sank with heavy loss of life, as the explosion set off her forward magazine. Another notable vessel was USS Bory, which rammed the U-405, got stuck, and then proceeded to engage the U-boat's crew in a running battle that involved Tommy guns, pistols, shotguns, flare launchers, thrown knives, and at one point an empty 4-inch shell casing that was hurled at a German sailor, knocking him overboard, since the ship's main battery could not be brought to bear, whilst it was vital to keep the submarine's crew away from their unusually heavily gunned deck mounts. Unfortunately, the ship was too badly damaged in the engagement, mainly from the ramming, and would sink later in the day. Finally, the USS Moody never made it to the Second World War, on the relatively understandable account of being sold to MGM Studios in the 1930s and then blown to pieces for the purposes of generating footage for an early action movie.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.